Well, today we're going to look at another favorite Bible hero, Samson, who was likely the strongest man to ever live. When God's Spirit came upon him, he had super strength. Now, chances are you've heard about this story or even seen some of the movies of Samson. I know there are several movies out there about it. I haven't really watched many of those because it's kind of hard to do the story of Samson and keep a PG rating. It's kind of, so I haven't watched too many of the movies. However, there is one thing I would change in every picture of Samson that I've ever seen, and what little I have seen TV movies, his appearance. They always make him look like this big, muscular guy. And the Bible doesn't say that. The Bible says when God's Spirit came upon him, he had super strength. It doesn't say anything about his appearance being big and muscular. So if I were casting the movie of Samson, I would pick someone with the physique like Pee Wee Herman. Okay? Some little skinny runt that when God's Spirit comes upon him, he starts throwing people around. I mean, that would be, and this is why they don't let me make Bible movies, okay? So, but that would be, how I'd probably have the comedy version if I were doing it. But Samson was a judge, which before Israel had kings is how God delivered them from their enemies and restored the nation to the path of following him. He would raise up a judge to do that work. And the judges were kind of a combination of prophet and hero warrior. Okay, it's kind of an interesting dynamic of how they work. And so Samson is in the book of Judges. He's not the last judge of Israel. That would be Samuel. Samuel is the last judge before they have kings. But Samson is the last heroic judge listed in the book of Judges. And you can find his story recorded in Judges chapter 13 through 16. However, the really sad part of the book comes after Samson. Judges, it starts off rough and just keeps getting worse as you go through the book. I mean, it's a rough book. But after Samson, chapter 17 on in the book of Judges, there are no more heroes. There's no more deliverance. It's just a list of Israel's sin and the destruction it keeps bringing upon them. And so we see in Judges, after Samson, it's just a story of how bad society can really get. So we should take note of this. Never think just because your nation was once godly and that people in your nation were once God-honoring, that means your nation cannot become the worst, most evil place on earth. It can't. Israel is a prime example. Here they were, God's people. God brought them out of Egypt. God led them through the wilderness. We have all of the miracles of the Exodus, all of the miracles of leading them into the promised land, of God giving them the land. And then they just go off into sin. And as we go through Judges, it just keeps getting worse and worse and worse. And their sin keeps even the most holy people allowed sin to keep creeping into their lives. Now, another thing to understand when you're reading in the book of Judges is that each judge tended to operate in a specific area of the country, a specific tribal area. And Samson operates primarily in the southern part of the country. We tend to read of it thinking of Israel as a whole, as a nation, but they're really more of a confederation of tribal states at this point. But whether north or south, the problem was the same. Israel had sinned, and because of that sin, God allowed their enemies to conquer them. That's what you see over and over in Judges. The end result was allowing, their sin was always having a life full of trouble. So in the case of Samson, they had been servants of the Philistines for 40 years. The area of Israel where Samson lives had experienced 40 years of oppression under the Philistines. Now, there's no record in Samson's story of God's people repenting. There's no record in Samson's story of them turning to God for help, and yet God still sends someone to help. So God in his mercy, he still sends someone to help them, to work this deliverance. And God chose for this a couple from the tribe of Dan, and Dan's original territory, it actually wound up with two territories later on, but Dan's original territory was right north of Judah. And I do have a map of the tribes here. You can see here is Dan, the tribe of Dan. Up here, Judah is this big one down here. And so this would be kind of like the middle marker. This is the Dead Sea. And so this is where Samson came from, this area here in the tribe of Dan. Dan was a pretty small territory there on the coast of the Mediterranean Sea, with the larger tribe being Judah to the south. And that's kind of who plays into this particular story. And all of this is the land God gave Israel, the land God promised Abraham, the land that they received when they came into the promised land with Joshua. And they divided it by lots and determined where each tribe would get. And so this is the land God had given them. But the Philistines also wanted this land. I have kind of what the Philistine territory would have been in this bright magenta. They would have claimed all this territory. And of course, the borders move back and forth as you go through the Bible based on who's winning wars and who's losing wars and, what claim. But these were major Philistine cities: Gaza, Ashkelon, Ashdod, and Ekron. They had these big cities that were their cities, and they claimed that territory. So at the time of Samson, the Philistines ruled over a good portion of what God had given Israel, especially what God had given Dan and Judah. The Lord chose a couple from the tribe of Dan to have a child, and this would begin the process of Israel's deliverance. We aren't told the name of Samson's mother, but we are told she was barren and that his father's name was Manoah. That we're told in the story. Now I'm going to there's a lot of material to cover here. So to make a long story short, since we have so much to cover, the angel of the Lord comes to Samson's parents, tells them they're going to have a baby and that he is to be a Nazirite from birth throughout his entire lifetime. This is the instructions he gives, and they do have that baby boy. Here are the instructions that God gave for this, the order of the Nazirite. This is in Numbers chapter 6, beginning in verse 1. Then the Lord instructed Moses, "Speak to the Israelites and tell them, when a man or woman makes a special vow, a Nazirite vow, to consecrate himself to the Lord, he is to abstain from wine and beer. He must not drink vinegar made from wine or from beer. He must not drink any grape juice or eat any fresh grapes or raisins. He is not to eat anything produced by the grapevine from seed to skin during the period of his consecration. You must not cut his hair throughout the time of his vow of consecration. He may be holy until the time is completed, during which he consecrates himself to the Lord. He is to let the hair of his head grow long. He must not go near a dead body during the time he consecrates himself to the Lord. He is not to defile himself for his father or mother or his brother or sister when they die, while the mark of consecration to his God is on his head. He is holy to the Lord during his time of consecration." And so a person who took the Nazirite vow, they could set themselves aside as a Nazirite for God's purposes under this vow. And while they did that, they were not to drink any form of alcohol. They were not to eat or drink anything that came from the vine, not even raisins, not grapes, not anything. And they couldn't, when I say they couldn't drink alcohol, yes, they could not have wine, but they couldn't have freshly squeezed grape juice either. I mean, none of it was allowed. They could not touch any dead body, neither animal nor human. They weren't to touch dead things. And they could not cut their hair. And as long as their hair was long, as long as they did not cut their hair, they were consecrated to the Lord. Now, most people would do this for a set period of time. They would make a vow to God. They'd say, I'm going to do this for this season, kind of, maybe in some modern culture of church cultures, you might see something like Lent, where they say for 40 days, I'm setting aside, I'm not going to have chocolate, or I'm going to have, well, this would have been something like that, where a lot of people would say, okay, for this month, I'm not going to cut my hair. I'm not going to drink wine. I'm not going to eat these foods. And they would set aside themselves for the Lord. Other times it would be until they fulfill a vow or a promise. God, I'm going to do this for you. And until then, I'm not going to eat or drink or do this. They'd be under their vow of the Nazirite. An example we see of this is the Apostle Paul. When he returned from Jerusalem from his missionary journeys, he goes to the temple to have his head shaved and to pay for the others who were under the vow. That was the Nazirite vow. They were under the Nazirite vow, and they had grown their hair, and when they get to the temple, they have fulfilled their vow. They would shave their head. There are 3 Bible characters who are listed as perpetual Nazirites from birth. Okay, there's 3. And it's interesting because all 3 had miraculous births from women who were barren. All three had this dynamic. The first was Samson. Samson is a Nazirite. The second is Samuel. Samuel was a Nazirite. And the third was John the Baptist. And so you see this dynamic of these people set aside from before they were born to serve God in this way. So Samson would become the beginning of God's deliverance for the Philistines. He would not be the complete deliverance, but he's the first in a list of heroes who fight against the Philistines. You have Samson, and then you have Samuel, and then you have King Saul, and then you have King David. Okay, and King David kind of finally finishes, winning. And after that, the Philistines, not that they're not around, but they're not nearly as big of a problem once David's done whipping them up, okay? So that's kind of the dynamic. Samson starts it, though. So God does use Samson, but in a really weird way. Actually, a lot of prophets and judges were odd people. Okay, I think if you wouldn't want to invite John the Baptist to bring food to potluck, you know what I'm saying? There's certain ones, but they're just interesting people, some of them. And God does tend to use people you wouldn't expect. That is true. But let's dive into Samson's story, and I think you'll see what I mean. Judges chapter 14, beginning in verse 1. Samson went down to Timnah and saw a young Philistine woman there. He went back and told his father and his mother, I have seen a young Philistine woman in Timnah. Now get her for me as a wife. But his father and mother said to him, can't you find a young woman among your relatives or among any of our people? Must you go to the uncircumcised Philistines for a wife? But Samson told his father, get her for me. She's the right one for me. Now his father and mother did not know that this was from the Lord, who wanted the Philistines to provide an opportunity for a confrontation. At that time, the Philistines were ruling Israel. This whole process of finding a wife seems bizarre to us because they had arranged marriages. But basically, Samson, goes to his dad and says, hey, Dad, I saw a woman I like. Go get her for me. Just go pick her up. Now they had to do a whole arrangement. The parents would meet and there's a whole process to the arrangements. We only get a few verses that kind of go through the whole thing. But the basics is Samson fell in love with and wanted to marry this Philistine girl. But his parents really wanted him to marry a good Jewish girl. Can you get some glimpses of Fiddler on the Roof play? His parents weren't necessarily happy about it. But it says specifically this was God's plan. This was God's plan to set up a confrontation. Not necessarily God's plan for these two to be together, but God's plan to set up a confrontation with the Philistines. And God will do that. He will use your emotions and he will use your weaknesses to put you in the right place for your mission. He will position you to where he wants you. Samson was called before birth for this mission, and God's going to put him where he wants it. So on his way to set up the wedding, Samson, and his family go down to meet the in-laws and, deal with all that. But one of his notable encounters happens on the way. And this is Judges chapter 14, beginning in verse 5. Samson went down to Timnah with his father and mother and came to the vineyards of Timnah. Suddenly a young lion came roaring at him. The Spirit of the Lord came powerfully on him, and he tore the lion apart with his bare hands, as he might have torn a young goat. But he did not tell his father or mother what he had done. Then he went and spoke to the woman, because she seemed right to Samson. After some time, when he returned to marry her, he left the road to see the lion's carcass. And there was a swarm of bees with honey in the carcass. He scooped some honey into his hands and ate it as he went along. And when he came to his father and mother, he gave some to them, and they ate it. But he did not tell them that he had scooped the honey from the lion's carcass. So this is an example of when God's power comes on Samson, and he just rips this lion apart with his bare hands. That's not normal. Okay, if you've been to the zoo, you've seen a lion. You don't just rip one of these things apart with your bare hands. They rip you apart with their claws. However, the problem in this story is actually later. I mean, this is a great miracle. God protects Samson. It shows his power and his strength through Samson. But what's wrong in this is when he finds the honey in the lion's carcass, he eats it. See, one of the things the Nazarite isn't allowed to do is touch dead bodies. He's not supposed to be touching that. He's supposed to be under the Nazarite vow. Not to mention the fact that eating honey out of a dead lion would have been unclean for any Jewish person. I mean, that's not kosher. You don't do that. But in his case, he's breaking kind of both. So this encounter with the lion actually plays into the confrontation Samson's about to have with the Philistines that happens at his wedding. Okay, I don't know if you've ever had a wedding with family disruptions. Okay, Samson has trouble here. So Judges chapter 14, beginning in verse 10. His father went to visit the woman, and Samson prepared a feast there, as young men were accustomed to do. When the Philistines saw him, they brought 30 men to accompany him. You want to talk about a wedding entourage, okay? 30 men. Let me tell you a riddle, Samson said to them. If you can explain it to me during the 7 days of the feast and figure it out, I will give you 30 linen garments and 30 changes of clothes. But if you can't explain it to me, you must give me 30 linen garments and 30 changes of clothes. Tell us your riddle, they replied. Let's hear it. So he said to them, out of the eater came something to eat, and out of the strong came something sweet. Now, after 3 days, they were unable to explain his riddle. On the 4th day, they said to Samson's wife, persuade your husband to explain the riddle to us, or we will burn you and your father's family to death. Did you invite us here to rob us? So Samson's wife came to him, weeping, and said, you hate me and don't love me. You told my people the riddle, but you haven't explained it to me. Look, he said, I haven't even explained it to my father or mother. Why should I explain it to you? Their marriage is getting off to a bumpy start. Verse 17. She wept the whole 7 days of the feast. And at last, on the 7th day, he explained it to her because she had nagged him so much. Then she explained it to her people. On the 7th day, before sunset, the men of the city said to him, what is sweeter than honey? And what is stronger than a lion? So he said to them, if you hadn't plowed with my young cow, you wouldn't know my riddle. The Spirit of the Lord came powerfully on him, and he went down to Ashkelon, which is one of their big cities, and killed 30 of their men. He stripped them and gave their clothes to those who had explained the riddle. Now, Samson liked riddles and rhymes. It's kind of a dynamic of Samson. In fact, I really want to call him the Riddler. But, there's a villain in Batman that already got that name, so we won't go there. So Samson makes a bet with these 30 men. Here he is gambling. He had invited them to the wedding feast. They can't solve his riddle. So, if they can solve his riddle, then he has to give them 30 sets of clothes. If not, they have to give him 30 sets of clothes. And that would have been quite a valuable commodity. I mean, clothes weren't necessarily cheap back then any more than they are today. And they fell for his trap, and they couldn't figure out his riddle, but they were really sore losers. Okay, they didn't like losing a gambling debt. And so they threatened his wife and her father, we're going to burn you down. We're going to burn you at the stake if you don't get us the answer. So she cries and she nags Samson until he tells her, and she tells them, and their marriage really got off to a bad start. Okay, now the bad news is it only goes downhill from here. Okay. Samson's story kind of goes downhill from here, but their marriage does especially. So Samson, they found out the answer. Samson now owes these 30 men a set of clothing. But this becomes Samson's excuse to begin taking vengeance upon the Philistines. Remember, God allowed him into this wedding, had this whole situation to create a situation of confrontation. Well, here it is. So what Samson does is the Spirit of the Lord comes on him. He goes down to Ashkelon, which from where the wedding was is about 28 miles. It's one of their main cities. And he kills 30 men. So he can pay off his gambling debts. He strips the bodies. I wonder if he washed the clothes after killing before. These things kind of, it'd be kind of a messy thing, killing 30 guys. But he takes the clothes and pays off his gambling debt, and he's mad. Now, that's the good part of the story. Here's the bad part. From here, things get worse. Judges chapter 14, verse 19, kind of very end of the verse. In a rage, Samson returned to his father's house, and his wife was given to one of the men who had accompanied him. So Samson married this girl, but since he stormed off angrily, his father-in-law assumed, well, he doesn't want her anymore, so he gives the wife to the groomsman, probably the best man. It seems like, maybe if he didn't show up to the wedding, then this guy's next in line. I mean, you're getting married today, one way or another, kind of a dynamic. It's bizarre to us, but this seems to be what they did in the Philistine territory. So Samson gets angry. He goes home, but he finally gets over his anger and he gets in the mood for some quality time with his wife and returns to see her. But he's told, sorry, we already married her off to someone else. His father-in-law, he says, sorry, I married her. I thought you didn't want her anymore. I married her to someone else, but you can have her little sister if you want. Samson did not want. He was not satisfied with her little sister. And this becomes the next confrontation with the Philistines. What Samson does next is he goes out and he catches 300 foxes and he ties torches to their tails. And he releases them into the standing grain and the stored grain of the Philistines, into their vineyards and into their olive groves to burn up their food supply. He takes his vengeance on the Philistines for the loss of his wife. Now, I'm telling you, by the time you get to the end of the book of Judges, all these people are just plain messed up. You kind of wonder, how bad can things get? Well, read the book of Judges. You can find out how bad things can get. I can further tell you, Samson was not an animal rights activist. Think of the poor little foxes. I mean, what did they do to him? I mean, but he does do this with the foxes. Samson takes his vengeance on the Philistines over his wife, and they respond harshly. Okay? This vengeance becomes a cycle, right? Remember, God's setting up a confrontation. He's going to bring down the Philistines. Well, here's what happens. Judges chapter 15, verse 6. The Philistines asked, who did this? They were unhappy about, all their food being burned up. They asked, who did this? They were told it was Samson, the Timonite's son-in-law, because he took Samson's wife and gave her to his companion. So the Philistines went to her and her father and burned them to death. Just get rid of the whole family. They're troublemakers. This family's causing us trouble. They're out of here. And that also would be kind of a, hey, Samson, you wanted your wife? Well, she's dead now. They killed his wife. They killed her whole family. Samson then responded by killing all of them. He goes to the town of Timnah, and the way it's written, you might assume he killed all the men of Timnah. It says he ripped them limb from limb with his bare hands. He kills them, slaughters them. He then goes to hide in a cave at the rock of Etam, which is actually quite a ways away east in Judah, kind of over near Bethlehem. So, he starts off over near the coast. He goes all the way over kind of close to the Dead Sea to go hide. And at this point, he and the Philistines are having friction. Okay? He knows that they're not happy with him. And I would imagine he's a little depressed. His wife's been killed. He was in love with this woman, and now his whole life seems ruined, and so he goes to hide in a cave. But the Philistines have had enough of this Israelite causing them problems. Who is this one man who's giving us trouble? So they invade Judah looking for Samson. They call out the army. Think about it. The whole army's out to capture this one guy. What does that say? But they invade Judah looking for Samson. And the men of Judah don't want any trouble. And so this is where we'll pick up. This is chapter 15, verse 11. It said, then 3,000 men from Judah went to the cave at the rock of Etam. So they asked Samson, don't you realize the Philistines rule over us? What have you done to us? I have done to them what they did to me, he answered. They said to him, we've come to tie you up and hand you over to the Philistines. Then Samson told them, swear to me that you yourselves won't kill me. No, they said, we won't kill you, but we will tie you up and securely hand you over to them. So they tied him up with 2 new ropes and led him away from the rock. When they came to Lehi, the Philistines came to meet him shouting. The Spirit of the Lord came powerfully on him, and the ropes that were on his arms and wrists became like burnt flax. and fell off. He found a fresh jawbone of a donkey, reached out, took his hand, took it, and killed 1,000 men with it. Then Samson said, with the jawbone of a donkey, I have piled them in heaps. With the jawbone of a donkey, I have killed 1,000 men. When he finished speaking, he threw away the jawbone and named the place Jawbone Hill. He became very thirsty and called out to the Lord, you have accomplished this great victory through your servant. Must I now die of thirst and fall into the hands of the uncircumcised? So God split a hollow place in the ground at Lehi, and water came out of it. After Samson drank, his strength returned, and he revived. That is why he named it Hakkor Spring, which is still in Lehi today. And he judged Israel 20 years in the days of the Philistines. It's interesting, the whole Philistine army is out after this one guy. 3,000 men of Judah go to tie up one guy. Tells you how dangerous they thought Samson really was. He agrees to be tied up as long as they promise not to kill him. Okay, you're going to hand me over to the Philistines. But in verse 16, he talks about killing 1,000 men. It's interesting because it's actually a little more poetic sounding in Hebrew. It's one of the spots. Samson liked rhymes. And in Hebrew, it kind of rhymes, but in English, we lose that. The men of Judah come, they tie up Samson, and they hand him over to the Philistines. There's no concept of trusting God. There's no concept of, here's this man who God has raised up to defeat the Philistines, and so we're going to be on his side. No, they're willing to sell him out quick. Hand him over to the enemy. But the Spirit of the Lord comes on Samson, and he grabs the jawbone of a donkey, and single-handedly he kills 1,000 Philistines. He piles their bodies up in heaps. I mean, that is one brutal warrior. Now, that alone would have been supernatural intervention, but God does even more, because after this battle, he's very thirsty. You know, killing 1,000 people probably takes a lot of energy to get thirsty when you're done with that. So he calls out to the Lord saying, have you accomplished this great victory through your servant? Must I now die of thirst and fall into the hands of the uncircumcised? What's amazing to me is, in spite of Samson's questionable character, God answers his prayer. God answers his prayer and opens a spring of water right there for him to drink. In fact, an interesting dynamic, Samson actually has more miracles attributed to him, assuming each of these, times the Spirit of the Lord gave him super strength. More miracles attributed to him than any other judge other than Moses. God was working through him. God raised him up for a purpose. So what's the very next thing he does after winning this great victory for God? I mean, he's won this victory and God has blessed him and God gave him water. What's the next thing he does? Well, in chapter 16, he goes and finds a prostitute to sleep with in the town of Gaza. Now, in case you're not up to speed on this, prophets and judges aren't supposed to be sleeping around with Philistine prostitutes. Okay, okay. Biblical knowledge here. Now, you can read that story in the beginning of Judges 16. It is an interesting little story. In fact, Samson goes into the prostitute and the town realizes he's there, and so they lock the gates behind him. They say, well, kill him in the morning. But he gets up in the middle of the night and he just rips the gates right out, post and all, and carries them to the top of the mountain. And so, once again, God's super strength worked through him. In Samson, we see a person who is an interesting mixture of strength and weakness. He has a lot of flaws, and yet God still uses him in spite of himself. See, God's grace is greater than our sin. God's grace is greater than our sin. However, we cannot overlook the fact that in the end, Samson was brought down and defeated by his sinful choices. He is the only judge of all the judges in the Bible. He's the only judge who was defeated by his enemies. And that was a direct result of his sin. All the others end victorious. I mean, they have great trials and tribulations and things, but they end victorious. Samson ends tragically. Well, here's what happened next. This is in Judges 16, verse 4. Sometime later, he fell in love with a woman named Delilah, who lived in the Sorek Valley. The Philistine leaders went to her and said, "Persuade him to tell you where his great strength comes from, so we can overpower him, tie him up, and make him helpless. Each of us will give you 1,100 pieces of silver." So Delilah said to Samson, "Please tell me, where does your great strength come from? How could someone tie you up and make you helpless?" Samson told her, "If they tie me up with 7 fresh bowstrings that have not been dried, I will become weak and be like any other man." The Philistine leaders brought her 7 fresh bowstrings that had not been dried, and she tied him up with them. While the men in ambush were waiting in her room, she called out to him, "Samson, the Philistines are here." But he snapped the bowstrings as a strand of yarn snaps when it touches the fire. The secret of his strength remained unknown. Then Delilah said to Samson, "You have mocked me and told me lies. Won't you please tell me how you can be tied up?" He told her, "If they tie me with new ropes that have never been used, I will become weak and be like any other man." Delilah took new ropes, tied him up with them, and shouted, "Samson, the Philistines are here." But while the men in ambush were waiting in her room, he snapped the ropes off of his arms like a thread. Then Delilah said to Samson, "You have mocked me all along and told me lies. Tell me how you can be tied up." He told her, "If you weave the 7 braids of my head into the fabric on a loom." She fastened the braids with a pin and called to him, "Samson, the Philistines are here." But he awoke from his sleep and pulled out the pin and the loom and the web. "How can you say I love you," she told him, "when your heart is not with me? This is the 3rd time you have mocked me and told me what makes your strength so great." Because she nagged him day after day and pleaded with him until she wore him out, he told her the whole truth and said to her, "My hair has never been cut because I am a Nazirite to God from birth. If I am shaved, my strength will leave me, and I will become weak and be like any other man." When Delilah realized he had told her the whole truth, she sent this message to the Philistine leaders, "Come one more time, for he has told me the whole truth." The Philistine leaders came to her and brought the silver with them. Then she let him fall asleep on her lap and called to a man to shave off the 7 braids of his head. In this way, she made him helpless, and his strength left him. Then she cried, "Samson, the Philistines are here." And he woke up from his sleep and said, "I will escape as I did before and shake myself free." But he did not know that the Lord had left him. The Philistines seized him and gouged out his eyes. They brought him down to Gaza and bound him with bronze shackles. And he was forced to grind grain in the prison. But his hair began to grow back after it had been shaved. So once again, we see Samson falling in love with a Philistine woman. We're not actually told the names of the other women in the story, but in this case, we are told her name is Delilah, and she goes down as one of the great Bible villains. In fact, she's the only Bible villain to actually bring down a judge, one of the Israeli judges. She's the one. The problem was that Samson let his heart overrule God's instructions. He went from marrying a Philistine to sleeping with a Philistine prostitute to now living with a Philistine woman that he wasn't married to. Do you see a pattern of problem here in his life? This sin is a slippery slope in which each sin leads to a larger and more destructive one, and it became Samson's downfall. This is what does him in. Samson's enemies took advantage of his moral failure and bribed Delilah to find out the source of Samson's great strength. To them, it must have seemed like magic. And understanding their beliefs, they believed in magic. How does he have this magical strength? He's suddenly so strong that he can destroy everyone and kill all our warriors. They didn't understand that it was God giving Samson super strength. And each of the Philistine rulers promised to give Delilah 1,100 pieces of silver. Now, there was at least 5 Philistine rulers, so that's, 5,500 pieces of silver. That's a lot of silver. So Delilah nags Samson to tell her the secret of his strength. He kept lying to her. I mean, he's making up all kinds of stuff. In fact, I'm thinking when he says, hey, new ropes. Well, didn't the people in Judah tie him up with new ropes? And he already snapped those. I mean, why would, but anyway, he's just making stuff up as he's not telling her the secret. But she nags him to the point that she does. He does finally tell her the secret. And understand, the strongest man in the world was no match for the nagging of an immoral woman. That's what happened. Don't think you can have a relationship with an immoral person without it eventually bringing you down. Now, reading the story of Samson, if you're like me, you're probably wondering, how stupid can he be? Okay. I mean, she keeps asking the same question. And not only did he have this trouble with his first wife, telling her secret, and then she ran and told the Philistines, but now he's got this with Delilah, the same thing happening and over. How stupid can he be? And yes, there are some people who seem really big on muscles and small on brains. I mean, that dynamic can exist. I'm not saying that's what Samson was, but it's possible. But I think the greater problem for Samson was he thought himself invincible. He thought that he was invincible. See, whenever you think you're invincible, you are about to fall. Whenever you think you can't fall, you're setting yourself up. And the day finally came when Samson did tell Delilah that he was living as a Nazirite. And we know that Samson had not obeyed God's instructions. He touched the dead lion. That's a no-no. Actually, the fresh jawbone of a donkey would have been a no-no. My guess is he probably didn't obey God's instructions about what to eat. I mean, he ate the honey, but did he eat raisins and grapes? He had a wedding feast. Did he drink wine and beer? We don't know for sure, but it just strikes me that Samson probably didn't have the moral fiber to sit there and abstain while everyone else was drinking. Doesn't strike me as who Samson was. But now Delilah shaves his head. And this is the last thread holding Samson to the commitment that God has placed on him. In fact, that was the final thing of when you ended the Nazirite vow, you shaved your head. The instructions God had given. Well, what's just happened? He has shaved. His head has been shaved. See, sin has a way of taking us away from God's purpose for our lives slowly. It creeps in slowly. It will take you away from Jesus one small step at a time. The devil's smart enough to know if he offers you the opposite direction, you're not going to take it. But if he says just a little to the left, just a little away, won't hurt. But see, the day will come when you'll wake up and you'll find that you've removed every trace of God from your life because you're following that sin. It will just keep becoming a bigger and bigger barrier. And I think this is exactly what we see happening to Samson. His moral failure led him to the place that God had left him, and he didn't even know it. And perhaps this is one of the saddest verses in the Bible. Okay, there's several of them that are really sad, but this one it breaks my heart. This is a sad verse. Look again at Judges chapter 16, verse 20. Then she cried, Delilah, Samson, the Philistines are here. And when he awoke from his sleep, he said, I will escape as I did before and shake myself free. But he did not know that the Lord had left him. He did not know that the Lord had left him. He thinks, I'm going to go out and do what I've always done before. I'm just the same person I always was before. But he's gone too far. His sin has taken him too far. And now here he is. He doesn't even know that the Lord has left him. It was obvious what was happening, but his sin had taken him so far from God that he didn't know it. Sin will do that to you. It'll blind you. It'll numb you. And sin will always take you farther than you want to go and always cost you more than you want to pay. If you allow it to keep creeping into your life, the day will come like Samson. Well, you'll wake up and you'll think everything's okay, but God will have taken his hand off you. See, I think God, what he does with us, the worst judgment we get is he finally says, Have it your way. Have it your way. That's really what you want to go do it. And then we face the painful consequences of the sinful choices we've made. So the Philistines came, they took Samson. God's power had left him. He was now a normal man. He had no more strength. They gouged out his eyes. They put him in prison so he could be slave labor grinding their grain. And there he sat to rot. But by God's grace, that is not the end of the story. Even in Samson's story, that's not the end. Even when God lets you hit rock bottom, even when his blessing and empowerment are removed from your life because of your sin, he still loves you and his grace can still reach you. We can be grateful for that. The Bible says simply that while Samson was there in prison, once again, his hair began to grow. God's grace began to work again in his life. And let's finish the story. This is Judges 16, verse 23. And it says, "Now the Philistine leaders gathered together to offer a great sacrifice to their god Dagon. They rejoiced and said, 'Our God has handed our enemy Samson over to us.' When the people saw him, they praised their God and said, 'Our God has handed over to us our enemy who destroyed our land and who multiplied our dead.' When they were in good spirits, they said, 'Bring Samson here to entertain us.' So they brought Samson from the prison, and he entertained them. They had him stand between the pillars. Samson said to the young man who was leading him by the hand, 'Lead me where I can feel the pillars supporting the temple, so I can lean against them.' The temple was full of men and women. All the leaders of the Philistines were there, and about 3,000 men and women were on the roof watching Samson entertain them. He called out to the Lord, 'Lord God, please remember me. Strengthen me, God, just once more. With one final act of vengeance, let me pay back the Philistines for my 2 eyes.' Samson took hold of the 2 pillars supporting the temple and leaned against them, one on his right hand and the other on his left. And Samson said, 'Let me die with the Philistines.' And he pushed with all his might, and the temple fell on the leaders and all the people in it, and those killed at his death were more than those he killed in his life." Samson's sin became God's shame. See, when he was overtaken by his enemies because of his own sin, they praised false gods for their victory. "Oh, our God Dagon, he's given us this great victory." See, we need to understand God will show us grace, but if we choose to live in sin, it brings him shame. It gives the world an excuse to shame Christ. But God's grace keeps working in our lives. Even when we've fallen, even when we've hit rock bottom, even when you're to the point your eyes are gouged out, you're sitting there in the dungeon, God's grace wasn't done with Samson. His hair began to grow back. And that's kind of the way God's grace does. Sometimes it starts slowly creeping back into your life. See, just because you've messed up in life doesn't mean the story's over. You will likely still have to live with the repercussions of your choices. But God's grace can still reach you and can still place you and take you to a place where you're useful for his purpose. In Samson's case, his hair began to grow back, and God's grace did not set Samson free from the dungeon. It didn't restore his eyes. It didn't make him whole. The choices that he had made still had those consequences. But God's grace did, however, answer Samson's prayer and give him strength to bring God glory and defeat Israel's enemies one last time. See, they're there worshiping Dagon. Look what Dagon's done for us. Well, Samson brought down the house. There was no more temple to Dagon there when he was done. Now, you've probably seen pictures, of the big stone columns in the pagan temples over there in the Middle East or Greece or that kind of thing. I mean, we're not talking little columns. We're talking columns. And God restored Samson's strength so that when he pushed them with all his might, he was able to move them, one man. This is a testimony to how much strength God invested and put in Samson's hands in those moments. Understand, he didn't have that strength all the time. He had it when the Spirit of the Lord came on him. That's why he couldn't just do it anytime. It says he killed more in his death than he did in his life. And so his final act, his final display of miraculous strength, was to strike a great blow against the enemies of Israel, these occupiers of God's land. And Samson single-handedly wiped out thousands of Philistines. And he destroyed the temple to their God. Now, maybe this morning you can relate to Samson. I know probably none of us, you've been to the gym, you've been working. Okay, not that part of Samson. Maybe you can relate to Samson feeling a little bit like him because maybe you've let sin creep into your life. And now it has you by the hair. Okay? That is what happened to him, right? It had him by the hair. Don't wait till it's too late. Don't wait until it's too late and the consequences of sin overtake you. Instead, come to Jesus so that he can set you free from your sin before it's too late. See, Jesus didn't come to condemn your sin. He came to set you free from it. He didn't come just to pay for it so you could stay in it. He came to set you free. And God's grace never ends. But the sooner you yield yourself to receiving that grace, the less damage you will experience from the sin you've chosen.